Thank you very much. I'm very, very glad to be here. And I'm glad that there is the snow, and I'm sorry that you had to go through a special difficulty to come, but I'm very glad you're here. So the first the outline. How is the sound? Okay, this makes sense. Okay. In the outline, well, just to keep it in mind, so to a certain degree, namely the general idea is that we are talking about the participation of rhetoric in the genesis of algebra. Algebra as we know it, that is European algebra of the 16th century, mostly in France, and so the transformation of Arabic algebra, which had been developing, of course, even if we take it in this in the main definition, at least from Al-Khwarizmi, means that is 9th century Baghdad. So then I'll discuss a little bit the inspiring historiography, that is where this kind of project come from. If we think of the second half of the 20th century, and I think that there were some inspirations, and I think because I believe very much in the fact that history of science corresponds to a certain degree of culture and science. And so if we ask ourselves some questions, it's because there are questions in science and culture that have to do with this. Even if we talk about Byzantium, for instance, or if we talk about, as in my case, early modern France. And so the person who inspired me in this sense was Lucien Febvre, of course, one of the founding fathers of the HESS in Paris. But most of all, he founded the what was called Encyclopédie Française, and wrote very important books on 16th century France, and in particular what is known as Le problème de l'incroyance au XVIe siècle, la religion de Rabelais, so the religion of Rabelais. The idea is that there were, one has to take into account many aspects of a particular society and culture in order to study even a single author. The so-called histoire totale. Then we will try to go deeper in the logic of the humanists. So 16th century logic as development of what had been discussed earlier, of course, first of all, by the classics. I know that here there are some classics people, and then also with the changes introduced by 16th century people. Then we go finally to some actual question in algebra of the 16th century, because in fact what the object of all this discussion is precisely the notion of question. So what is a question? And at that time that was crucial because there was a particular logic that put question at the center. And then the examples will be taken from Jacques Pelletier-Dumont, who is a 16th century algebraist, and Fermat, who is an early 17th century algebraist and mathematician who introduced very important elements of differential calculus, let's put it this way. I mean, anticipation, as they called it in the old times, beginnings of the differential calculus, even though it will be fixed by Leibniz. In fact, Leibniz acknowledges a kind of filiation from Fermat. And then I will try to connect to some more recent debates on rhetoric and mathematics. So the main idea is that French symbolic algebra, as we know it, and we give a definition more precisely, launched mostly by Jacques Dumont and François Viette, and these are the dates, grew out of mathematics within the humanistic and juridical culture, and particularly out of the interaction between mathematics and the disciplines of the text. The main references, as I said, the inspiring bibliography or studies were classics such as The Two Cultures and the Scientific Revolution by Charles Snow, and Rhetorica e Logica by Giulio Preti. Charles Snow, the essay by Charles Snow is mostly known just as The Two Cultures, and it has been published as such. But in fact, as you can see, the original title was The Two Cultures and the Scientific Revolution. What did he mean by scientific revolution? This is particularly interesting for me because scientific revolution is often associated to the 16th and 17th century. And he means the following. Some would prefer to go back to the first large-scale chemical or engineering industries, round about 60 years ago, that is at the turn of the century, 20th century. For myself, I should put it much further on, not earlier than 30 or 40 years ago. And as a rough definition, I should take the time when atomic particles were first made industrial use of. And I believe that the industrial society of electronics, atomic energy, automation is in cardinal respects, is different in kind from any that has gone before, and will change the world much more. Very prophetic. It is this transformation that, in my view, is entitled to the name of scientific revolution. I think at the end I'll try to connect this idea. And, but basically, he regretted that there was this great divide between the two aspects of culture, that is mathematical or scientific culture on one hand, and humanist culture, humanities. And then Giulio Preti, 10 years later roughly, wrote Rhetorica e Logica. In fact, he tried to establish a philosophical conciliation between the two worlds in terms of history of thought, as he called it. However, both of them considered, in fact, the great divide as a necessary clarification, I think. And so the stakes were in terms of truth. On one hand, there was mathematics, logic, and so science, value-free science, in fact. And on the other hand, there was rhetoric, and so discussions about values. And it is about this that I try to develop. In fact, there was another book that was relevant to my project when I started at the end of the 20th century. That is Perelman and Olbrecht's Theaetica, published in 58 also. And it's called Traité de l'argumentation. This book launched the study of argumentation as a general theory of which logic is a special case. So in this argumentation, so argumentation was considered global and logic local. And in that sense, I think that they followed, actually, that's what my interpretation philosophically globally is, that they took into account what had happened around the 1930s, namely Gödel's theorem that basically we had to choose between completeness and consistency, and on the other hand, Turing's undecidability theorem. So, in other words, sorry, that's right. Sorry. In other words, formal reasoning, as they put it, formal reasoning comes from a process of simplification only possible under particular conditions within isolated and circumscribed systems. So, exactly as Gödel and Turing said in their own context, let's say. So, in my research, clearly I take, I'm rather close to what they said, in the sense I take into account what they said, because I, following Lucien Febvre, I take the idea that rhetoric is mostly a strategy of thinking. So it's not mainly an art of persuasion. Of course, it is also, it can be also an art of persuasion, but it is not mainly such thing. It's rather a strategy of defining and solving problems. Lucien Febvre took what he called outillage mental, as I mentioned before, mental tools, to be three kinds of disciplines, namely language, logic, and mathematics. All of them went through major changes in the period that is studied particularly, that is the 16th century, France mostly. And how he put it is, our purpose is to see how people formulated their problems and tried to solve them. That means, of course, everything. It was a very general statement, but in particular, it had to do with this idea of outillage mental. So, in fact, I think that he took this definition as a purpose of the historian, precisely because he was somewhat, he shared the point of view of his object, the people he studied. And concretely, this invites to do what he did, namely to look for documents about the history of books, about the history of printing, history of universities, and academies, and of civic schools, that is smaller schools, not necessarily in Latin. Furthermore, there was one of his students, Robert Mandrou, who gave more suggestions for research on French mathematicians, because they were mostly juridically trained, and some of them were clearly jurists, like Fermat, precisely. He did mathematics only on a side. And so it is particularly important, if you want to study mathematics of that time, to see if they think totally differently when they do one thing or the other, or if rather they share some aspects. So now I give you, of course, a little test that is an arithmetical question, which actually comes from commercial arithmetic in the Middle Ages, but there are Arabic versions, Hebrew versions, etc. But in any case, there is a nice discussion by Pelletier about this, and so I would like you to do it. So 2 men leave from the same place, the second 10 days after the first. The first walks at 9 leagues a day, the second at 14 leagues a day. How long before they meet? Now, the point is to try to look at this problem in a way that does not presuppose symbolic algebra. Okay, so, and now we come with a digression, let's say, in logic, in fact, we start with the vernacular languages. So, Valla wrote in Latin about the vernacular following Dante, for instance, in the De Vulgare Eloquentia. His grammatical, philological, and historical studies of Latin made him an important author for the construction of the new vernacular, which was Latin, in the colleges. He promoted Latin as a vernacular or everyday language and used Cicero and Quintilian as a canon for it. Maybe for many of you this is totally obvious, but I have to be self-contained, so I mention this. And in that sense, he purified medieval writing and teaching. The original texts by Cicero and Quintilian were taken as a basis for learning logic, because this is the other aspect. The very Horatius, practical Horatius by Cicero and Quintilian were taken as books, textbooks, if you want. And we know because there are manuscripts, the annotated copies, interlinear comments of the classical texts. So this was one way of learning. And this led to the rhetorical reform of dialectic. That is, you start from how language is actually spoken, or at least written in the classics that should be taken as a model. And you extrapolate the logic of it, and you take that as logic. So this leads to some consequences. So now we go back to Aristotle, of course. And so the main distinction between logic and dialectic is that, or logic and rhetoric, I meant logic and rhetoric, is that in rhetoric we move from probable or plausible premises, and we proceed necessarily with, and we get to the plausible conclusions. And whereas in logic we have to take true premises, and again we proceed necessarily to true conclusions. So the main difference between rhetoric and logic is supposed to be, are supposed to be the premises. So in other words, the structure is comparable. Of course, there are different degrees of certainty and so on, but the idea is that the main change is with the premises. Then we have Stoic logic and Cicero. So the one that Lorenzo Valla has chosen as main model. So we start with nociones comunes, and here I have an example. Some of this, of course, is already in Aristotle, but it's just a stress that is different. So it's a kind of a simplification of Aristotle, let's put it this way. So we take nociones comunes such as the whole is greater than one of its parts. Then we have axioms, which are usually postulates and basic theorems of a theory. Then we have intimemata, which are dialectical syllogisms with plausible premises, as in Aristotle, but here are accepted also abbreviated syllogisms. Well, that is a connection with Boëthius, but in which one premise is implicit. And here I give an example of abbreviated syllogism, well, which is sort of the purpose is to smile. Then the next is Aristotle and Cicero on what we are looking for, that is on the question, which was called by Aristotle the thema. So in posterior analytics, which is the crucial text for mathematicians of the 16th century, sensitive to all these discussions, because, among other things, posterior analytics has not only kind of the same approach in logic, but also stresses the role of the various mathematical sciences, besides arithmetic and geometry, and therefore was definitely chosen among the works by Aristotle. Anyway, in posterior analytics, we find this sentence. There are 4 kinds of questions we ask, corresponding to the 4 kinds of things we know. That is, everything we know is of this sort. That the thing is, why it is, if it is, and what it is. And this is the Greek version of it. The purpose is to find the middle term. So all we know is to find, of course, the middle term in a syllogism, given that we haven't even mentioned it, but the reasoning that goes in both rhetorical and logical logic is the way to reason is syllogism, of course. And then Topica, that is Cicero, says pretty much the same thing, almost the same thing, but not quite. That is, he says, the questions of theory are of 3 kinds. We ask whether the thing is, what it is, and which it is. And even if they both describe here theoretical questions, aiming at the truth and aiming at the middle term, that is, which will then lead to a true conclusion. In any case, and as we have said, because we privilege the fact, the Stoic logic, that is, we take axioms which can be plausible, but not necessarily in the sense of Aristotle. So even if they both describe this theoretical questionnaires, aiming at the truth, Aristotle mentions Togliatti, that is the cause, the why. Cicero has 3 kinds because he actually aims at juridical truth. He connected. His main move is to connect truth studied by his logic to juridical truth. And here we have a little bit of social history applied to the 16th century. That is that, as in Athens and Rome, and the Senate, there is a small group of people which have small democracies, let's put it this way, well, in Athens and among the Patrici in Rome. And then the idea is that there are the 3 sorts of rhetoric that I list here. So pleading in trials, defending or discrediting, or making decisions in political world. But in any case, all of this is in terms of democratical decisions in which, so there is this function of rhetoric that is collective decision. And that is what I would like to convey, because I think that in the 16th century, when they restored this, recovered these ideas, they had in mind Italian cities and the fact of becoming actual responsible at various levels in these small cities, in the German-speaking countries, in the Netherlands, and this is not just imagination, because we can see it very clearly for instance, for the pupils of the humanistic colleges, that we'll talk about it later, and they actually become important politicians, or at least important having responsibilities in the cities. And so collective decision, let's say, a negotiation, a dialogue, and all these discussions of the time have to do with this new context. So going back to Cicero's De Inventione, as a first part of the Oratio, which is a theme appearing explicitly in algebraic books, for instance, being connected to inventio, because algebra has this feature of trying to solve a problem with the method of inventio. So in Cicero we find anything which implies by presentation or by debate a controversial point, either of fact or definition, or of law, or qualification, or of trial, contains a question. We call constitutio the question which gives origin to the cause. I mean the trial. Constitutio is the first conflict of the two theses. So it arises with the response of the defendant. For instance, you did it, I didn't do it, the defendant, and or he can say also, I had the right to do it. For instance, it was a self-defense. If I fecisti, non feci, io feci. Bon. In any case, in other passages we find in the classics, the idea, the example is homicide, for instance, and the defendant can say, I didn't do it, or can say, well, but I had the right to do it for such and such a reason. So it is another case, it is another causa. Not in the sense of cause, but in the sense of kind of trial, and because it's another law. So, sorry, I forgot to, so now you have a chance to take a look. And so we find the same idea of that we found before, that is the definition of a question, as a question that has to be resolved really in the court. In the Institutio Oratoria, again, Quintilian completes this process of absorption of the juridical notion of truth in the general training of the orator, and in the 16th century, the general training of what the orator is, that is basically a figure in the administration and of the cities, mentioning another similar passage by Cicero. So most writers offer us three general issues. Cicero adopts these in the Orator, and thus thinks that they embrace everything which comes into dispute or contention. They are, does it exist? What is it? What sort of thing is it? So we see that truth and general question as a scientific question, and legal questions conflict. Then what happens in terms of teaching? We have the abacus schools, which are civic schools in the vernacular for merchant and arts and craft people. They teach elementary arithmetic for commerce, and elementary geometry for surveying, for instance, engineering, and art of war. They exist mostly in Italy, Spain, German-speaking countries, south of France, and connected to Spain. Then they offer also calculation with Arabic numbers, starting in the 13th century, mostly for beginning of the 14th. And then they propose this new use of numbers compared to Boethius, for instance, that is calculation with integers, rational numbers, admit the appearance of irrational numbers, computations with sexagesimals for astronomy, and all sorts of money and measures. And that is actually most of the actual texts for abacus schools have this feature of containing a lot of questiones dealing with the translation of measures, metrology, if we could call it, but in fact applied metrology, that is problems in which you have to transfer from one money to another, etc. And to this, so one crucial tool is the rule of three, and there is this glissement. The rule of three becomes quickly a sort of equation, becomes an introduction of some algebra, some elementary algebra, which was called the art of the cosa, or cosa with two S's. In fact, it means the thing, the art of the thing, and in which we have to imagine that the coefficient, in fact, is means so many times the cosa. So it's a bit different from our algebra, but still it is starting to be used very often. And then in the humanist colleges, of course, we actually see teaching of Valla spread all around Europe. In particular, we can mention that from Rome, where he was born, this kind of teaching went to Leuven for Erasmus, and in which it was founded the trilingual college with Hebrew, and then Paris with François Ier. This started in with Guarino's college, Venice, Verona, and Ferrara, and then we can mention, of course, Juan Luis Vives in Spain. The idea was always to use vernacular languages as main reference, in fact, but in terms of structure, but always compared to Latin as a vernacular that is used in everyday teaching. And then this changed the logical model, because in fact the logic of Neo-Latin languages or of German-speaking countries, in other words, the vernaculars in general, proposed a different logic, and therefore the study of grammar was strictly connected to all this, but today, of course, we cannot talk also about the grammar. In any case, all this was connected, so the new Neo-Latin, for instance, languages were part of the teaching, but again, as I said, there was this vernacular, a language meant as Latin used every day, and then teaching also of elementary elements, in any case, of practical arts, so the teaching of the abacus schools that I mentioned before. This happened not only in Spain, thanks to Vives, but also in the Reformation countries, in which method as a dialectical tool was dialectical again is this new logic. So teaching logic as so that's a pity that I went too slowly, I guess. So the Lorenzo Valla. Again, we have certainly as an agreement. We could analyze much better this, but I guess I put it aside because we don't have time. We have a repetition of what we have said, but yes, again, this notion of question, as we have already found, but he repeats it in his own text on dialectics. So dialectics as a new logic, okay? Then the centrality of the question. I lost it. Well, anyway. There was another slide which you don't see. So method of analysis. I have to mention that there was also Galen, who among others mentioned this other method present in ancient logic, that is to start from the question, supposed to know the solution, and then see what consequences the solution produces, and finally checks these consequences. So this is called analysis. Why did I put this in evidence? It's because in Rabelais, I was very happy to find this page, because it's the most commented page, annotated page of his Galen. Rabelais' Galen, of course, he was mostly a medical doctor, and he analyzes in terms of dialectics precisely this passage of Galen in which Galen actually is talking about mathematics. He's talking about mathematics as model for axioms and demonstration in medicine, in the ars medica. But what is important to remember is that it included the use of it included the presence of an artist, a master of the art. It was not enough to have the axioms and the deductions, but you needed to create a doctor who was able to choose among all this. So this is the idea to keep in mind. Well, symbolic algebra. I think that, roughly speaking, you know, we can come back to it if necessary. The book I took the problem from is this one, appeared in 1554, 1554. So he says, algebra is an art of counting perfectly and precisely and of solving all arithmetical and geometrical questions having a possible solution by rational and irrational numbers. Its great singularity consists of the invention of all sorts of lines and surfaces where rational numbers do not help. It teaches us how to discourse and to look for all the points necessary to solve a difficult, another term that appears very often in this kind of text. And it is a part of the question. And it shows that there's nothing so hard nothing is so hard that the mind cannot reach it when provided with the proper means. So again, other passages about dialectic. Apparently we can't see them, but at least we can see this, namely in the place of the unknown number you are looking for, put one R, that is one thing. I use the R for representing the sign of the causa. And write your discourse according to the formality of the proposed question until you find an equation fitting to it, and that you have reduced it if necessary. Then divide, do the operation, and this is the part that in a way doesn't require, that is the automatic part. And it's funny because already in Galen we find automatos to say that, to talk about this part of the process. And then before anything, it is important to understand, that's what he says, it is important to understand that the main prerequisite for algebra is to be able to reason or discourse well, to give a shape to the question in order to arrive at the equation. So giving a problem the shape of an equation is the crucial part. And that is part of the master of the art. Then we have the famous problem that you probably have done in the meantime. And what happens here is very elementary, but what is crucial is that Pelletier asked himself, wait a minute, here we start by talking about leagues per day, or actually at the beginning we talk about days, and then at the end we can't attribute the same value to the x, what would be for us the x, namely to the causa. So the discussion is about that, and in order to manage this, it's necessary to be again a master of the art. I just go quickly through the Cardano's problem with the two unknowns, just to mention the fact that Cardano has this problem, which is an ancient problem again, and Pelletier gives a version of it in which the innovation is at the same time notational and structural. So one can really recognize the kind of rhetorical work and the dialectical work that he did on it, as he acknowledges formally also. And then here we have Fermat, his student. And so in Fermat, we have something that we can call similar, I mean, in the sense that, or at least we can recognize this kind of work that he conceived of as dialectical work, that is his work, what he calls la méthode. So leaving aside all the other contents, let's look at the structure again. And we see that he has the structure of a question. That is, if we want to determine the tangent, now of course it would be nice to have a picture, but I don't have it at the moment. In any case, precisely the move that he makes is from the picture to a structure which is quite characterized as a series of equations. And that is the important part, that is to imagine that the problem is solved, give a name to the unknown, which is the incertum part of the dialectics of the question, and then I write the problem in terms of an unknown and known terms. Then there will be two states of the problem, two cases and two solutions if you want, and then he replaces A, which is his x if you want, with A plus E, and then he eliminates. So the idea is again to have a master of the art who is able to switch from the picture to a structure in which there are many equations, in which the problem is stated always close to a certain property. Finito. So that is, I had counted an hour, apparently it's a bit less than an hour, sorry for that. So the more recent debates have developed other aspects, namely, for instance, Revier Netz, who I admire very much, is the shaping of deduction in Greek mathematics, talking about the interaction between diagrams and text. Or more recently, the book by Reyes and Wynne, his real colleague I know very well, who I invited in Paris and so forth, but he mostly looks at mathematics as a part of a rhetorical argument. In other words, without entering into the internal dynamics of mathematics. So my approach is mostly what I took from Lucien Febvre, that is how people formulated their problems and found strategies to solve them. And this leads us to algorithms and to the need, again, to have masters of the art to be able to articulate and negotiate the use of them.
Thank you, Giovanna. It was very rich and a lot of material to think about, really. I have many questions, but I'll first ask if anyone has questions for Giovanna? So I'll start. Can you hear me? No. Now it's fine. Yeah. Okay. So I'll start from Galen. And this idea that method and analysis come from there. I found it also, I think that Cesare Vasoli was the one
Vasoli,
who introduced it. But why Galen? Because I mean, we have the analytical method really spelled out in the commentaries on homogeneous, and Vessela here has worked a lot on it, and it's exactly the same.
No, I understand, but they, I think, I mean, what I figure, I don't know if, in any case, what I found plausible from my studies is that they actually were looking for something that concerned all the sciences. Mm-hmm. And many, because I mentioned the jurists, but in fact there were many doctors, people who study medicine, especially in this kind of context, which was separated from the church, or the churches. And so the idea was that if there was a connection, and also it's true that Galen, well, there are two things about Galen. One is that he's pervasive in terms of material. I mean, that he had a very clear idea of how, starting from mathematics, you can develop something else, even though it has nothing to do, strictly speaking. And they liked this idea very much. I mean, the fact that there was one whole unique model for many sciences. It was very compatible, actually it is in full agreement with posterior analytics, the idea that secondary sciences are all depending on, in fact, on mathematics, because so it was an idea of the soul, an idea of the mind, an idea of if you want, matrices universalis, even though it's stupid to use in this. I mean, it's the same thing, but it's another discussion.
Yeah, but by mathematics you mean really mathematics in
very simple mathematics.
Okay.
So the very basic part of Euclid that is supposed to be for everybody, because the idea of making deductions from very few principles. So that is the idea. So to have a very simple experience of mathematics, and that's why, by the way, the passages they mentioned, and I went through too quickly, but was for the same that Grineus in the first, in the Editio Princeps of Euclid presents as the model of the method. So that's what he does. The reason why I take it has to do with this encyclopedia view of mathematics. Mathematics as a key for the encyclopedia.
So I have also more broad question. I mean, when you mentioned this idea that I don't remember who that was, that they wrote that scientific revolutions can happen only within circumscribed or systems of thinking, reasoning.
Yes, this is Perelman. The idea is that not quite scientific revolution. That was that logic, logic as one, so truth all the way, so to speak, can function only in a closed system, very limited.
And you are against that, right?
No, not necessarily, because that's it. Is what taken seriously, of course. It's not to say that now, but that is what Gödel says also. I mean, if we want certain, if you want completeness of a system, of a formal system, you need to give up consistency, and vice versa. If you take a consistency, then it will not be complete. So it is
I had like a more provocative question, but we think in cognitive terms of, you know, adaptivity.
Yes.
Then, I mean, the ways of reasoning that work should work also beyond limited systems. They should work because they speak to our hardwired system of reasoning. So,
yes.
And how, I mean, do you think that this kind of cognitive approach could be used also for this material?
I think so, because I think that what happened after the 1930s, and that is when Turing and Gödel did the thing. In fact, it's not that one stops doing math or science, but that you have local systems. So you apply, basically, maybe it's a little bit of the same idea. This is an extension, but in any case, it is a bit of the same idea in the 16th century, namely, you try to apply the same scheme, and then it might work better or less well, but still you can apply it, and it helps because it helps to visualize. I think the choice is whether is between thinking that it is a totally value-free or not. I tend to believe that it's not a total value-free.
Of course.
I believe that there is a permeability between the various systems, and in fact, human beings should explicitly discuss about things. That is, I think, clear what I said. And but it is something that they see in their own little way. Seems that in the 16th century they had it quite clear, namely that there was a need to have a formal systems, but also to use to use them in an explicit way, to discuss about the use of these formal systems.
Yeah. and I think, I mean, I really like the point about politics, because I could see it also with my material, because all this homogeneous material was very popular also in the Polish Commonwealth, like this axis between Poland and Lithuania, which was one of the first experiments of representative democracy in the 16th century, and they loved it for education. So it really resonated with them.
In fact, I didn't talk about Hermogenes, but you know, Stasis are everywhere in what I read. I mean, it's just, and they had rediscovered the Hermogenes. Actually, in a first version of my paper, I had thought of talking about Pedro Nunes, who supposedly taught Hermogenes in Coimbra or in Lisbon, but in fact the manuscript that is actually available doesn't seem to be authentic. So I gave up that, even though probably it was in the same milieu, so it's not that crazy to think that in fact he also did something on that line.
So there's like a topic for the lunch break.
Exactly.
Thank you so much. Thanks again.